He's a big, scary guy, you know, he's a really big... I've never been as scared in my life as fighting this guy, but you know what, I got a lot of power too, and I believe in myself. I really believe in myself. I've worked so hard over the years, and this man right here, my father, has worked harder than anybody, so this belt is dedicated to my father.
Every UFC era has one decision that fans look back on and ask the same question. What if it had been handled differently? For many people following the heavyweight division, that question now revolves around Tom Aspinall. Not because he lacked talent, not because he failed to prove himself, but because his rise forced the UFC into one of the most difficult situations the division had faced in years. At first, everything seemed to be unfolding perfectly. Aspinall was finishing opponents with remarkable speed, showcasing a skill set that looked unusually complete for a heavyweight. He combined fast hands, technical boxing, high-level grappling, and movement rarely seen in a division traditionally dominated by raw power. With every victory, expectations grew. Fans began calling him the future of the heavyweight division. Analysts praised his composure. Even experienced fighters acknowledged that he presented problems unlike almost anyone else in the weight class. But then the momentum slowed, not because Aspinall stopped winning. Instead, the heavyweight title picture became increasingly complicated. Championship negotiations, injuries, interim titles, and the presence of established stars created a situation where sporting merit, business priorities, and timing no longer aligned perfectly. From an analytical perspective, that's where the controversy begins. The debate isn't simply whether Tom Aspinall deserved more opportunities. It's whether the UFC allowed the heavyweight division to reach a point where one of its most exciting champions spent too much time waiting instead of competing. And as months passed, that discussion only became louder, because every delay raised the same question. Was the UFC protecting the division's biggest fights, or did it unintentionally hold back the fighter who represented its future? To answer that, it's important to understand how Tom Aspinall reached this position in the first place. Long before he entered the UFC title picture, Tom Aspinall was already developing a reputation as one of the most complete heavyweights in Europe. Unlike many fighters in the division, his game wasn't built around a single weapon. He had boxing, he had Brazilian jiu-jitsu, he had wrestling, and perhaps most importantly, he possessed a level of speed that immediately separated him from the rest of the heavyweight division. From an analytical perspective, that combination made him an unusual prospect. Heavyweights are often expected to trade mobility for power. Aspinall seemed capable of doing both. As he entered the UFC, his performances quickly validated the hype. He wasn't just winning fights, he was finishing experienced opponents with a calm, technical approach that rarely looked rushed. Rather than relying on wild exchanges or one powerful punch, he controlled distance, picked his moments carefully, and capitalized on mistakes with remarkable efficiency. Every victory reinforced the same idea. This wasn't simply another rising contender. This was a heavyweight with the potential to redefine expectations for the division. His confidence remained measured. His interviews reflected maturity rather than arrogance. And inside the octagon, he consistently looked composed under pressure. That combination made him increasingly difficult to overlook. Fans began discussing championship opportunities. Analysts highlighted how his style differed from traditional heavyweights. Even veteran fighters acknowledged that Aspinall's athleticism and technical ability presented a unique challenge. By this point, momentum was entirely on his side. But in MMA, momentum doesn't always guarantee opportunity. Sometimes a fighter reaches the top just as the division becomes complicated. Title holders, interim championships, injuries, contractual negotiations, and business priorities can all reshape the path forward. And for Tom Aspinall, that timing would become one of the defining stories of his career. What separated Tom Aspinall from most heavyweight contenders wasn't just that he won, it was how he won. From an analytical perspective, Aspinall represented a new generation of heavyweight. Traditionally, the division has been associated with explosive power, slower movement, and a higher reliance on individual moments rather than sustained technical exchanges. Aspinall challenged that image. He moved like a much lighter fighter. His footwork allowed him to enter and exit range quickly, making it difficult for opponents to establish rhythm. Instead of standing directly in front of dangerous heavyweights, he constantly adjusted his angles, forcing them to react rather than dictate the pace. His boxing also stood out. Rather than throwing every punch with maximum power, Aspinall prioritized timing, accuracy, and combinations. That efficiency meant he often landed cleaner shots while conserving energy for later exchanges. But striking was only part of the equation. His grappling created another layer of uncertainty. Opponents couldn't focus entirely on defending punches because they also had to respect his wrestling and submission skills. That ability to threaten in multiple phases of MMA made preparing for him especially difficult. From a strategic standpoint, this is what made Aspinall such a unique challenge. Pressure fighters struggled to close distance safely. Counter-strikers found it difficult to predict his entries. Grapplers couldn't assume they would hold a clear advantage on the ground. Very few heavyweights offered that level of versatility, and as his performances continued, the conversation shifted. The question was no longer whether Tom Aspinall belonged among the elite. The question became whether anyone in the division had a complete answer for him. Ironically, that growing dominance created a different kind of problem, because once a fighter becomes the obvious next step in a division, the organization itself must decide exactly how and when to move forward. This is where the debate surrounding Tom Aspinall truly begins. From an analytical perspective, the UFC wasn't dealing with a lack of contenders. It was dealing with a heavyweight division caught between two different priorities. On one side was sporting merit, on the other was business. Aspinall had done almost everything expected of a future champion. He defeated high-level opponents, captured the interim heavyweight title, and continued proving that he belonged at the very top of the division. Normally, that path would lead directly to a title unification bout. Instead, the situation became increasingly complicated. The heavyweight championship picture remained tied to Jon Jones, whose status as one of the biggest stars in MMA naturally carried enormous business value. At the same time, injuries and scheduling delays kept the division from moving as quickly as many fans expected. As months passed, frustration began to grow. Supporters of Aspinall argued that an interim champion shouldn't have to wait indefinitely for clarity. Others believed the UFC was making the logical business decision by preserving a potential blockbuster fight involving Jon Jones. Both arguments had merit, but that's exactly what created the controversy, because every delay had consequences. The heavyweight division slowed, other contenders remained in limbo, and Aspinall found himself defending an interim title instead of immediately competing to unify the championship. From a competitive standpoint, that felt unusual. Interim championships are generally intended as temporary solutions when an undisputed champion can't defend for a period of time. When that temporary period stretches longer than expected, questions naturally follow. Did the UFC make the right business decision, or did it unintentionally create uncertainty in one of its most important divisions? That question continues shaping the heavyweight landscape even today. As the uncertainty surrounding the heavyweight title continued, the entire division began to change around Tom Aspinall. What had once looked like a clear championship path gradually became a waiting game. From an analytical perspective, this wasn't just about one fighter. It affected the entire division. When the championship picture remains inactive for an extended period, contenders are forced into difficult decisions. Do they stay active and risk losing their position, or do they wait for the title situation to become clear? Neither option is ideal, and that's exactly what happened at heavyweight. Several top-ranked fighters continued winning and calling for opportunities, while others found themselves competing without a clear understanding of where they stood in the title race. Meanwhile, Aspinall continued doing what champions are expected to do. He stayed prepared, he accepted difficult matchups, and when he returned to the octagon, he reinforced his status with another dominant performance, reminding everyone why so many believed he was already the division's best active heavyweight. From a competitive standpoint, every impressive performance only increased the pressure on the UFC. The longer the situation remained unresolved, the louder the criticism became. Fans weren't simply asking when Aspinall would fight again, they were asking why the heavyweight division seemed unable to move forward despite having an interim champion who was ready to compete. At the same time, the discussion began extending beyond rankings. It became a debate about what an interim championship should actually represent. Should an interim champion be expected to wait indefinitely, or should the division continue moving if the undisputed title cannot be defended within a reasonable time frame? Those questions didn't just affect Tom Aspinall, they challenged how fans viewed the UFC's approach to championship management itself, and that made the story much bigger than one fighter. As the criticism surrounding the heavyweight division intensified, the UFC found itself in an increasingly difficult position. From an analytical perspective, the organization was balancing two objectives that don't always align. The first was competitive integrity, the second was business. On one hand, Tom Aspinall had continued proving himself every time he stepped into the octagon. He had earned the interim heavyweight championship, defended his position, and consistently looked like the division's most active elite fighter. On the other hand, the UFC still had a major major attraction in Jon Jones. Jones remained one of the biggest names in combat sports, and any fight involving him carried enormous commercial value. From a business standpoint, waiting for a potential blockbuster matchup was understandable, but every month that passed without clarity came with a cost. Momentum began shifting away from the title itself and toward the uncertainty surrounding it. Fans questioned the purpose of an interim championship. Media discussions increasingly focused on delays rather than fights, and Aspinall's achievements were often overshadowed by conversations about what wasn't happening instead of what had happened. Eventually, the pressure became impossible to ignore. Public opinion continued building. Analysts debated possible solutions. Even fellow fighters began weighing in on how the division should move forward. From a broader perspective, this wasn't necessarily a case of the UFC making a single bad decision. It was a series of difficult choices that gradually created a situation with no perfect outcome. No matter what path the organization chose, someone would feel overlooked. And that may be the biggest lesson from the entire situation. Sometimes managing a championship division isn't about finding the perfect answer. It's about choosing the option with the fewest long-term consequences. Whether the UFC succeeded in doing that is still being debated today. Looking back at the heavyweight division over the past few years, the biggest story isn't simply about who held the championship, it's about how quickly the landscape changed. When Tom Aspinall emerged as one of the UFC's most complete heavyweights, he didn't just create a new contender, he created a new standard. From an analytical perspective, that's what made the situation so challenging for the UFC. The organization suddenly had two realities to manage. One was the commercial value of established stars like Jon Jones. The other was the competitive reality that Aspinall had established himself as the division's most active elite heavyweight. Balancing those priorities was never going to be easy, but as time passed, one thing became increasingly clear. The conversation was no longer centered on whether Aspinall deserved his opportunity. Most fans had already accepted that. Instead, the debate shifted toward whether the heavyweight division had been allowed to move forward quickly enough. Because championship belts aren't just symbols, they represent activity, progress, and the continued evolution of a division. When that momentum slows, uncertainty begins replacing excitement. That's exactly what happened here. Did the UFC make a huge mistake? That depends on how the situation is viewed. From a business perspective, preserving major fights can make sense. From a sporting perspective, rewarding the most active and deserving champion is equally important. Perhaps the real mistake wasn't one decision, it was allowing the heavyweight title picture to remain uncertain for so long that the focus shifted away from the fights themselves. And through all of it, Tom Aspinall kept doing the only thing he could control. He stayed ready, he kept winning, and he continued proving that he belongs at the very top of the heavyweight division. In the end, that's why this story matters, because long after the debates fade, fans rarely remember who waited the longest. They remember the fighters who proved they were ready when their moment finally arrived.